Well, joining us now to give us further insight on that story, we're joined by Professor of Political Science, University of Southeastern Norway, Mr. Glenn Diesen, who's joining us from Oslo. Also, we have researcher at Institute for Russian and Eurasian Studies, Mr. Greg Simons, who's joining us from Uppsala. Gentlemen, welcome to the program. Let's start off with Mr. Diesen in Oslo. I want to get your thoughts on this recent development. How much of a difference, in your opinion, can the deployment of Patriot defense missile system make for Ukraine?
Well, I think the benefit will be limited. It's a very complex system. It doesn't operate well necessarily with other air defense systems. But that being said, it's another step in this escalation. Keep in mind, this is all happening at a time when the Europeans and the Americans are now also going to send heavy tanks. So there is this gradual, incremental escalation going on. And I think the more Ukraine loses on the battlefield, the more heavy weapons the NATO countries will provide in order to, keep the war going. So it is definitely escalation, but I don't think this is going to be a huge game changer, though.
Greg Simons, let's talk about the issue of the United States now beginning to train Ukrainian forces for the Patriot missile system. First of all, do you agree with our guest in Oslo that the Patriot system is not a game changer? And Russia has stated that this basically means that the United States is complicit in this war. What do you think?
Well, I completely agree with Glenn. I mean, if we look at the performance of the Patriot missile systems in the 1990-91 Gulf War, they had an abysmal success rate, which is why Israel doesn't use Patriot. It created its own Iron Dome system, courtesy of the US taxpayer. And if we look at the whole idea of this as a proxy war, I mean, even before the fighting started, it was clear that this was going to be a proxy war which is driven by the US. I mean, Victoria Nuland stated even before the fighting started that it was the intention of the US to inflict a geopolitical defeat for Russia in Ukraine. And if we look at the statement of Alexei Reznikov, the defense minister of Ukraine, who recently stated in a media interview that Ukraine is physically fighting the war for NATO. It's paying in blood, and this is why the West is obliged to send weapons and other things to Ukraine to keep them fighting.
Mr. Simons, I'm going to stay with you. As the Western weapons pour in to Ukraine, does this increase the chance of this conflict broadening in scope and maybe spilling over into other regions as well?
I mean, this was always a risk from the very beginning. I mean, if we look at Poland's incremental sort of escalation in this, I mean, this is problematic for them, but it's also problematic for other countries. The fact that Russia is nuclear armed is a huge deterrent, because this can go much worse. So hence that this has been something not done directly, that Western troops, apart from those ones who are on loan, if you like, from different armies, whether it's the Polish army or even New Zealand soldiers fighting in Ukraine. This is, I mean, as long as they don't do the fighting directly, this should put a certain lid on it going too far.
Glenn Diesen, a while back, the Russians stated that the fact that Ukrainians are getting so much military backing and support is actually leading to the fact that Ukrainians are not wanting to come and sit at the negotiating table and to try and find a peaceful solution to this conflict. Do you agree with that notion?
Yeah, I think that's been proven, because as we remember, after the Americans sabotaged the Minsk II agreement for 7 years, when Russia invaded, their main strategy was simply to push up against Kiev and then force Ukraine to implement the agreement, which the Americans had encouraged them not to do for 7 years. Because what the Americans had told them was, we'll give you weapon, we'll gradually strengthen you. You don't have to implement any peace agreement. Well, what we found out after Russia invaded at the end of March, early April, the Ukrainians and Russians were actually close to an agreement on the key issues. And at this point in time, the British and the Americans again intervened, and they promised Zelensky all the weapons he would need. They would just continuously pump in weapons until they would be able to defeat Russia. So that was the agreement. Zelensky will send the Ukrainians to the front. The Americans and British and the NATO will arm them, and they can keep this war going. So this is obviously something that's been going on for quite some time. There has been no interest in finding any peace agreement. I would say that this has been an opportunity for the United States. They can, as many American politicians have already said, from Lindsey Graham to others, all they have to do is supply weapons, and Ukrainians will go to the front, and they can, effectively kill Russians and weaken Russia in perpetuity. So this has been a goal, I would say, for quite some time. So obviously that is a key motivation for continuing to send all these weapons, indeed, to avoid any peace agreement. I mean, even now on Orthodox Christmas, Russia suggested, let's take a day off fighting. And again, the first thing from the Americans and the Europeans was, no, we don't accept this. So there has been an opposition to negotiation, an opposition to ceasefire. And again, I think this is correct what my colleague here is saying. This has been a proxy war from day one since 2014. And we talk a lot about helping Ukrainians, but I think in NATO we have taken advantage. We have used them as an instrument against Russia. If we wanted to help Ukraine, not only would we encourage negotiations, but we have a huge bargaining card. We could promise no more NATO expansionism towards Russian borders, and Russia would probably make huge concessions in order to get this deal. But we're not going to do this because that's not the objective of the United States, and hence it's not the objective of NATO.
Greg Simons, in your opinion, what are the prospects of seeing a peaceful resolution to this war right now? Our guest in Oslo believes that that's pretty much not on the agenda of any of the Western backers of Ukraine.
I would agree with Glenn. I mean, it's been showing that this has been something which has been creeping incrementally, and one can even go before 2014. I mean, if we look at 2008 even. But what we see here is a living of Brzezinski's geostrategic imperatives, where the US has now got Ukraine as a client state. And I mean, as a client state, it is utterly dependent on the US and its allies to exist, and has no independence of its own. It must do what it's told. And unfortunately for Ukraine, if they looked at the history of what has happened to other client states of the US through history, I mean, it's not a good future ahead for Ukraine, because, I mean, as soon as they lose their value and their interest, they'll be dropped and discarded like others. I mean, Osama bin Laden at one stage was a US asset, and we can see what happened to him as one only lesson from history.
Mr. Deason, one last question before we leave you. You mentioned that what we're seeing right now is effectively a proxy war. What is the end game for the backers of Ukraine here, the supporters of Ukraine, most notably the NATO countries, and what ramifications are we talking about for European countries who's basically suffered much of the burden of this war since it started?
Well, the objectives are quite clear because the United States published them almost 4 years ago. I would ask your viewers to look up a report by RAND Corporation called Extending Russia. which is a think tank which is driven by the intelligence community in the US. And this report was also ordered by the US government. And what the report was about is how to weaken Russia as a rival over time. And again, in 2019, and the main argument was keep arming Ukraine, instigate more conflicts between the Ukrainians and the Russians, and force the Russians to spill more blood, more treasury, more military force into this conflict. And again, this has been a very open strategy. This is something that American leaders have also argued after Russia invaded, that this should be a goal, to weaken Russia over time. Lloyd Austin made this very clear. I think that there has been some miscalculations, though, because the goal was to weaken Russia militarily. It was to destroy its economy, its currency, and isolate it in the world. But what we've seen is Russia's now winning this war of attrition in this awful war with tens of thousands dying. Its economy has been shored up. It's been reorienting its economy away from the West, which is causing economic devastation for Europe, which no longer has access to this cheap, reliable energy. And lastly, this goal of isolating Russia internationally, well, it's simply failed. There's hardly any countries outside NATO that has joined in on these sanctions. The ones who have US allies like South Korea or Japan, they're working very hard to water down the sanctions as they don't want to suffer the consequences. But overall, yeah, you're correct. It's the Europeans who have really jumped on the grenade here and sacrificed their economies in the belief that they were going to, crush the Russian economy. So it's I think this has been a huge miscalculation ever since 2014, and even the humanitarian aspect of using the Ukrainians as this way, using them as a battering ram against Russia, it's highly immoral. And again, this is I think it's been a huge miscalculation, especially for the Europeans, as they have been sacrificing a lot more than the United States.
All right, thanks a lot, gentlemen. Glenn Deason joining us from Oslo, and thanks to Greg Simon speaking to us from Uppsala.